So not just holding attention at this body or mind, but there's an even more powerful way that's more reliable and leads to more benefits and ultimately enlightenment. And this is the practice of mindfulness for insight. Now, a lot of people teach mindfulness, but unfortunately, they teach it in quite an incorrect way, not the way that the Buddha intended, and they get mixed up between samatha practice and mindfulness for insight practice. They might call it insight, and they may call it mindfulness, but it's a very different type of mindfulness than the Buddha intended. The Buddha intended mindfulness for insight, which insight means vipassana, if you've heard the word vipassana. And a lot of people teach this, or claim to teach vipassana, but when you see the technique that they're employing, the technique is something to do with keeping attention or holding attention. And so whenever there's keeping attention or holding attention, even if it's short, that's a samatha practice. So we can check the last segment to be reminded of what a samatha practice is like and what its purpose is. Here there's another way where the mind can automatically become interested in our own body and mind, and it doesn't have to happen with holding. In this sense, it happens by recollecting. And that is what true mindfulness is about. It's about recollecting. So here we're not recollecting, a story from last week or something that happened when we were a child. It's not reminiscing. This type of recollecting is a non-verbal, non-thought type recollecting. It's that moment of recollection. And what is being recollected is what just happened, or what the mind just did, or what the body is doing presently. So, for example, when I said the word presently, I had a fist and I opened my hand. And I didn't really know that I was intending to do such a thing. I'm not sure, but it just kind of happened. And at the moment that it happened, my mind, or the mind is maybe more appropriate to say, because it wasn't me doing it. The mind realized or recollected that that is what was going on. It's like, oh, look at that. It had that sense. There weren't the words, but it just sort of became aware of something that was going on in the present moment without holding any attention. Just a split-second moment of recollection. So, for example, in that space just there for a second or two, your mind was thinking something. Can you be able to recollect, not the words that you were thinking, but just the sense that, oh yeah, there was babbling in my head there for a second. Right? That's the type of recollection. So it's not a holding. It's a recollection or a realizing or noticing just a moment ago what the mind was just engaged in, or perhaps what the body was doing. So in my case, there was a shoulder shrugging that happened. Now, I didn't have a conversation with myself, a preamble, okay, I'm going to shrug my shoulders. It just sort of happened. Now there was an itch on my knee and I lifted my heel to scratch the back of my knee. Right? So there was an itch, there was a recognition of that. Then the leg moved to go, the other leg moved to go itch it. And there was a recollection of that. Then the mind went into thinking about what was going to be talked about next. And there was a recollection of that. So it's like a noticing. And then eventually we be able to more easily call it recollection or be more comfortable with that word, although it sounds a little strange perhaps if you're not a avid mindfulness practitioner quite yet. It becomes easy to call it recollection when it becomes automatic. that we notice what the body or what the mind is doing so regularly, so often, that the mind becomes familiar with the different things that the mind or heart or body do, right? It gets familiar with what making little moves and shifts of the body, the shrugging the shoulders, the turning the head, the smiling, the fingers moving this way and that way. It gets familiar with what the body moving is like. So then it recollects that quite often. And there are these gaps in being totally immersed and engaged in what it is that the body is doing. And there's like a sense of being able to be separate from it or awakened from the blind state of being immersed in what we're doing. It's like we wake up out of it, just for a moment. And then there's another moment of recollection and another. Until what starts to happen is the mind becomes more interested in seeing what the body and the mind are doing at times, than distracting itself or knowing what's going on in the outside world. And yes, that is distracting ourselves. When we're busy trying to know what's going on the television, what other people are saying, being involved in different social networks, distracting ourselves, trying to maintain a state of comfort or happiness, when all the while it's breeded, it's at its foundation rooted in not wanting to see or know the suffering that's actually right there. So this way, through this practice of mindfulness, of right recollection, or being able to notice and become familiar with different states of the body and mind, then we automatically, in a deeper level, start to become more interested in, for example, what we're feeling, or what the position of the body is in, or where the attention is at any given time. Become more interested in that stuff than we do in the outside world and all its distractions. So rather than being interested in, what that person said was funny, we become more interested in how that felt in the heart. If it felt open, happy, liking, giddy, how did it feel in the heart? Or, when somebody says something that is becoming less interested in, oh, that was terrible what they said. They should never say something like that. Even I'm offended or whatever. Instead, to have a look and see the sadness, the anger, or the lull or the anxiety that was created internally. Right? Studying or seeing the suffering, not trying to fix it, not trying to change it, but just seeing it as it actually is. When we get familiar with the different states that arise in our heart, then there's an automatic mindfulness that emerges. We start to recollect immediately whatever it is that has arisen in the heart. And the heart is certainly below the neck. It's more upper abdomen, lower chest area where these things arise from. They're almost tangible. They're not quite physical, but they're easy to, with some practice, they're easy to sense as not just thoughts, but something that arises in and is visceral in hovering around that lower chest, upper abdomen area. And so instead of having our mind move out into the world for its distractions all the time, which is what it does when it isn't practicing mindfulness or practicing samatha. That's the default that we've learned since our birth and not being involved in Buddhist practices, or at least some types of meditation practices where, unfortunately, from what I've seen traveling the world and going to all different centers and listening to different teachers, what I can pick up is it's pretty much all samatha practices of one kind of another, being attentive and holding at a particular object. If it isn't coming from the understanding that the Buddha brought to this world, and of course was picked up by his disciples and then moved along lineages, and then is amazingly still available today here in Thailand and with all the different teachers in the world. I seeked it out, and I believe I found the truest teachings, and see how they're misconceived and misunderstood a lot in the West, mostly in the interest of trying to hold and keep happy states rather than seeing the truth of suffering. And then once we see the truth of suffering utterly and clearly, and once we see the truth that there isn't any state, even happiness, that can be sustained, when we see that utterly and clearly, when we study it enough to see the truth that everything that arises also falls, then there's a wisdom that is achieved, that is a happiness that is far more reliable, because it doesn't depend on anything being in any particular way in our lives, even in our hearts. Our heart doesn't have to feel happy. Something negative can happen. There can be, somebody strikes us or says something that hurts. The mind then forms or formulates an anger that comes up. It's sensed in the chest area, but it's known to be something that's just a moment, and then there's another moment. The next moment, it doesn't exist. It's known to be impermanent, and so that none of these things can actually truly substantially hurt us or cause any sort of depression or any sort of long state of discomfort anymore. Right? We become free of the world. Free of the world in a sense that there isn't anything that can happen in the world that can cause a sustained state of suffering in our heart. Even the body in pain or the body dying, at most, can make a feeling of discomfort happen for a moment and then disappear. In the end, that discomfort in the heart for a moment won't even arise. That's beyond my understanding. That's my teacher's understanding. So hopefully this, as it appears as 3 parts, 3 15-minute segments here, helped us to get an introduction to understanding the path of what mindfulness really is, mindfulness for insight, what samatha is, and how most of what is taught in the world is, in spirituality, is some type of samatha, adhering to something, holding something for a rest, which is definitely necessary. It's just not our final answer. It's a supportive practice that we should practice if we can for a few minutes every day to give that mind of ours a rest. And to see that we have a great amount of potential as a human being, and we should have direction and goals and understanding of where we're heading. And indeed, if we do have a goal for next year coming up, I have a course in achieving success in our goals with Mind Power coming up starting Sunday night. So you can contact me at healinglife.org@gmail.com to enter that course. So thank you everybody so much for listening, and bye for now.